Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Spar&Brawl. On Tuesday, the United States and India signed a major military defense agreement called BECA. This agreement marks the last foundational military agreement that India and the US will sign. The US typically signs four military agreements with its close allies. BECA, the latest of the foundational agreements, will give India access to classified geospatial data as well as other military related information. More concretely, the agreement will allow the US to share sensitive satellite and sensor data, which is expected to help India in striking military targets with pinpoint accuracy. Speaking of the significance of this agreement, US Secretary of Defense Mark Esper explained the rationale behind this agreement, at least the official public version. Quote, based on our shared values and common interests, we stand shoulder to shoulder in support of a free and open Indo-Pacific for all, particularly in light of increasing aggression and destabilizing activities by China. Both India and the US are due to participate in the upcoming Malabar naval exercise in the Indian Ocean next month. The drills will feature all members of the so-called Quad, an informal alliance of the United States, India, Japan, and Australia. Alright, Sam, before we get into the geopolitical implications of this deal and what it means for different countries and the region, let's start with the basics. What does this deal mean for India and for the US?
Well, India and the US, they both have different objectives from this agreement, from this treaty, but they seem to both have largely at least, have the same target, which is China. America is trying to contain China internationally, and India has two major border disputes with China. Uh, One of which India feels China has basically control over a piece of its land in Ladakh. Uh, so they are both basically trying to curtail increasing Chinese influence or power. Uh, that's the main target of this specific deal. But obviously, the details for each side is different. Maybe we can go into those details now about, for example, what are the specific benefits for India.
Yeah, so what are the benefits? Just list a few benefits that you see for India and for the US.
Well, for India specifically, it's more about military might because India has been falling behind China, especially in terms of technology, in terms of military technology. Now they have access to basically certain US satellite information, which allows them to track Chinese troops even in China and to basically keep a close eye on their borders, because that's been a key reason why India, was behind China. They couldn't see what's coming. Now they have an advantage in that they will be able to see Chinese move as soon as Americans do, which is basically as soon as Chinese do move. So the balance of power there is becoming a bit more balanced, so to speak. Apparently, I'm not quite sure about this. I think you might be able to give us some information about that. Apparently, they are now getting some new technologies or new, again, satellites like targeting technologies for their missiles. So their missiles will be far more accurate and far more deadly. And this was the angle that most of Indian press took while covering this agreement before and after the deal was signed. We even had in Hindustani Times, which is one of the more popular newspapers in India, we had an article, I think a week before this talk, that a journalist argued that India should get into any alliance that counters China, because India is increasingly feels threatened by China. Even in inside borders of China, India might be able to basically see their movements, their troop movements, and all that, which is key to, because their regions that are disputed tend to be highlands. So timing is key. We covered what are the benefits for India. So what are basically the benefits for the US? Yeah, certainly I think the priority, or at least the more important uh, section of the world for the US is the Pacific. But to be honest, US is everywhere. US is global, so they do care about Chinese growth even in Indian subcontinent, right? Although I would definitely agree Pacific for them is more crucial because if the Chinese basically, and they do already, have bases in the Pacific, then they have a very, America becomes a much easier target, American mainland, right? So while from India, it's not possible. They even recently changed the name of a U.S. command in. I think the name was U.S. Command in Pacific, and I think they changed it to Indo-Pacific Command to, reflect the more unified front. And America has been pushing for a stronger alliance between India, Japan, uh, Australia, and to a lesser extent South Korea. So basically, US does not seem to directly, in terms of like India does not offer any equivalent of the strategic information that US offers to India. India does not offer the same to the US. India offers to US a relatively a strong ally that will play an active role against China because for example, Australia has very strong economic ties with China. So does India, by the way. But Australia is probably because it doesn't share a border with China, might not be as aggressive. While India has a arguably ancient, rivalry with China. So what US is largely gaining with this alliance is a active, especially under the Modi and BJP, the political party that he represents, which are basically right-wing Hindu nationalists. Under them, America, especially people like Mike Pompeo, neoconservatives, they find somebody with perhaps equal fervor in in their anti-China policies, in their anti-China activities. So that's what US is gaining. This is obviously besides what is always goes under discussed, which is the obvious financial benefits that US gets by selling more jets, by selling more defense weapons, by probably charging for certain services, which I haven't read the details on, but I'm sure that's also a huge incentive for US companies, people like Mike Pompeo, who are heavily financed by arms companies and such organizations. That's the other incentive for the US. But probably the more political or geopolitical one is gaining a active ally. It was interesting. I even read an article, which I think it was in Foreign Policy, which was saying that America should be very careful that to not create another case like the Arab countries where or even European countries where they rely solely on the US for their protection. They don't even, so it's clear that American policymakers, especially foreign policymakers, they are looking for somebody who's as active, because Europe Europe is in rhetoric is largely on the same side as the US, but it's not necessarily as active or as involved as US wants it to be, even in the NATO, right? So I think that's the key thing US is gaining from the Indian alliance, especially considering that even though Indian economy isn't doing well because of Corona, and it wasn't doing well before Corona, the the Nehorunda Mundi and his party remain highly popular. I think he still has above 70% approval ratings in India, and even relatively high approval rating among Muslim Indians. So they see him as a stable ally in many ways, a stable and aggressive enough ally.
That's very interesting. And yeah, before that, you were talking about how, later on the US can sell its jets and everything. This doesn't seem to be part of the current agreement, But if this is such an important foundational agreement, defense agreement, then it will most likely lead to more arms sales and everything to India. But there's also one country that we've kind of haven't mentioned yet, which is Pakistan. So I mentioned there are kind of three narratives that I understood behind that I got from behind this agreement, and one of them is again the Indian press. It was talking about, hey, this will allow us to have more accurate strikes and all that. But and then the example that they gave was actually a Pakistani example. So it was like, if but after this X attack from Pakistan, if we had this information, then we could have retaliated. So what do you think this deal means for Pakistan?
To be honest, I think that's largely this deal and India's growing relationship with the US is partially due to internal factors, India becoming more nationalistic, blah, blah, blah. It's also partially due to the fact, though, that Pakistan grown, has grown, you can't even say growing anymore, has grown really close to China. Indian press regularly, even print the print or Hindustani Times, which are sort of center left or liberal newspapers, even they describe Pakistan as a client state of China at this point. So yeah, it's certainly I think it's more of a reaction and basically balances the playing field again for India. That the China Pakistani alliance cannot necessarily have the upper hand or have the element of surprise, at least, right? And besides that, you could even argue this is partially a reaction to China's deal with Iran as well, in a way. Even though Indian press doesn't go as far as claiming Iran is a client state of China, because it's a different balance, but they do, they're very worried about these type of things. So I don't think it's far more about China than it is about Pakistan, because at this point India views Pakistan as China's extension, really. They don't see an independent Pakistan, so to speak.
Yeah, so the US has pretty much struck a bunch of deals in the past month or two, if you think about the one between Israel and the UAE, another one now, but they're all deals that, of course, I don't think the US public cares for much now, which is
So
quite interesting. They're probably getting less attention and less credit to Trump than they would have if they were a few months ago.
Oh, yeah, sure. Although I would say that deals with UAE and Sudan and Bahrain, they were much more of a publicity stunt
Hmm.
at least with UAE and Bahrain. Everybody knew that Israel had relations with them, had high-level relations
Yeah.
like intelligence sharing and all that. So that was more of a publicity stunt for the election, specifically targeted at hardcore Christians and older Jewish voters. But this one is genuine. This is a genuine strategic achievement or milestone, whatever. And in fact, if Biden and Kamala Harris, a lot of Indian people are rooting for Biden because Kamala Harris has some Indian
Hmm.
ancestry. So this is not something that if Biden comes, he's gonna throw out the window or whatever. This is probably a lasting deal, because uh, yeah, it's very crucial for US basically to contain China, or at least to try to contain China. It would be very interesting to see what will be the reaction in Chinese press. I haven't had the time to look at that, but that would be quite interesting.
Yeah, the story just came out today, and the US elections are in 6 days. So we shall see. But anything else you would like to add about this specific story? Any countries or dynamics that we didn't discuss?
No, I don't think so, but I do think we should keep an eye out on the whole Japanese, Australian, Indian alliance, because this may be a sign of growing alliances in that region as well. Because I mean, long term, this is opinion. This is not anything else. But long term, I don't know if US can maintain this many international alliances unless it does a complete shift from, let's say, Arab countries to India or whatever. So I think we are going to see more of regional blocks rising up to an extent. That's that's what it is. But I think we hopefully will come back to this story when there is more details in the about Chinese response, about other stuff.
Yeah, and so speaking of Australia, Japan, we actually did a video on Quad. Well, the new Quad 2.0. So if you go on our channel and you just search Quad, there's a whole video on Quad. What is Quad? Why did it die once? Why is it coming back and everything?